Hi, I'm Andrea with Garrett Library. This week's Railroader reading comes from the book Living with Cannibals by Michelle Sloan. I'd like to share from the chapter about Diane Fossey. She was born in San Francisco in 1932. Upon her graduation from high school, her stepfather seemed not only to expect her to pay a great deal of her own way, but also insisted in pushing her in the direction of exactly the kind of office work that she loathed. Ignoring him, she chose to steer her own course and soon was accepted into a program for pre-veterinary medical studies at the University of California, Davis. By her second year, however, it was clear that she would need more than a passion for animals to manage passing grades in chemistry and physics. It was a career crossroads, and Diane's solution was to transfer schools and switch her major to occupational therapy. In 1956, with the experience of several months in the California hospital system, she headed east to a new life in Kentucky, where she'd been offered a job as director of therapy at a Louisville Children's Rehabilitation Center. 4 years after her move, a close friend invited Diane to accompany her on an African safari. Diane couldn't afford to join her. She began scrimping and saving every penny that she could. In the acknowledgments of her book, Gorillas in the Mist, written in 1983, Diane offered thanks to the Henry family of Louisville, who gave her a collateral loan and helped her put together the $5,000 she estimated the 7-week trip to Africa would cost. She agreed to mortgage her salary for the next 3 years at the exorbitant rate of 24% interest. It was worth it to her to get to Africa. Arriving in Nairobi in September of 1963, she was recovering from one of her bouts of pneumonia. Accompanied by a guide, she began to make her way through Kenya and Tanganyika, now Tanzania, and on into the Congo, now Zaire. She had already fulfilled one crucial aspect of her dream journey when she'd found legendary anthropologist Dr. Louis Leakey at his home base camp at Olduvai Gorge near the edge of Serengeti National Park. She'd listened closely as he stressed the desirability of further in-depth fieldwork on the great apes. She took note of his praise of the long-term chimpanzee project, now in its third year, that was headed by his protege, Jane Goodall. Leakey shared her fascination with the gorillas in the Virunga Mountains, where next she was headed. Diane Fossey's very first near-gorilla encounter was with one whose shrill screams she'd only heard while climbing on the trail. The animal had charged her lead native guide, but disappeared by the time she could catch up. Despite an injured ankle, she summited Mount McKenna, saying that the terrain was almost straight up and we had to hang on to vines to get along or go on hands and knees. Swept away by the physical magnificence of the noisy group of gorillas she'd finally encountered on her next to last day in the mountains, she felt herself haunted by a sense of relatedness to those creatures whose distinctive part feral, part human smell had heralded their extraordinary presence. It was difficult to tear herself away from her African adventure and return to daily life in Kentucky, though she never doubted that she'd return to learn more about the Virunga gorillas. Dr. Leakey's attention was drawn to some photographs and articles I had published about gorillas since my return from Africa. After a brief interview, he suggested that I become the gorilla girl he had been seeking to conduct a long-term field study. Our conversation ended with his assertion that it was mandatory I should have my appendix removed before venturing into the remote wilderness of the gorilla's high-altitude habitat in Central Africa. I would have agreed to almost anything at that point and promptly made plans for an appendectomy. As it turned out, somewhat to Diane's surprise after leaving her appendix behind, her new mentor had merely been testing her determination in his own peculiar fashion. He hadn't actually expected her to go through with the surgical procedure. Leakey's interview with Fosse took place in 1966. She then had to wait for the outcome of his efforts to raise money to cover her field expense. She was still paying off the money she owed from her previous trip. Then, at the very end of that year, she received the news that Leighton Wilkie, the backer of Jane Goodall's work, would fund her efforts as well. She was on her way back to Nairobi at last. Her major task would be to secure the paperwork from the Congolese bureaucracy that would allow her to settle in and organize her base operations. 2 years later, in 1968, the National Geographic Society's Committee for Research and Exploration also joined in supporting her. Her first report, Making Friends with Mountain Gorillas, appeared in National Geographic in January 1970, introducing the Gorilla Girl to the world. In it, she said, "For the past 3 years, I have spent most of my days with wild mountain gorillas. Their home, and mine, has been the misty wooded slopes of the Virunga Range, 8 lofty volcanoes. The highest is 14,787 feet, shared by 3 African nations, Rwanda, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The textbook instructions for such studies are merely to sit and observe, but she preferred a different approach. She practiced the arts of hooting, grunting, and belching loudly. She made herself chew the same foliage they did, kept low to the ground when moving, and became adept at grooming herself in the gorilla manner. I scratched my scalp noisily. Almost immediately, a gorilla would begin to scratch. It was not clear who was aping whom, but her efforts at mimicry paid off when Peanuts, a particularly playful gorilla, overcame shyness and reached out to touch Diane's hand, possibly the first encounter ever between a wild gorilla and a human. 6 months after Diane Fosse had established her camp at the isolated Kabara Meadow site, she was rudely hauled off Mount McKenna by armed soldiers. They explained to her that, for her own well-being, she would be held in a detention center. The Belgian Congo had become the newborn political entity of Zaire, and it quickly became obvious to her that she would be safer anywhere but where she was being detained. Making her escape through a combination of bribes and stealth across the border to Uganda, she soon learned that orders had been issued to shoot her on sight were she to return to Zaire. After a strategy meeting with Louis Leakey in Nairobi, it was decided that she would return to the Varangas, but to the Rwandan side of the mountains. She was also made aware that she had already been declared missing and presumed dead by the U.S. State Department. Her overriding thought was only that there were still gorillas to find and mountains to climb. Within 2 weeks, she was reestablishing contact with some of the wandering guerrilla groups she had known at Kabara. They recognized me and held their ground at about 50 feet. I was able to see that an infant had been born since I left. It was a most wonderful welcome home gift. Nothing about the life Diane Fossey chose to lead in Africa over the next 18 years could be said to be easy. Like the endangered animals that were her beloved obsession, she was continually driven to protect herself from the hostile onslaughts of nature, as well as from the intentional villainies of humans. Though she was a celebrity revered in the world that lay beyond the mountains, Diane remained a fierce and immovable threat to the poachers, herdsmen, hunters, black marketers, and other exploiters whose plans and desires ran counter to her own. They placed in constant peril everything for which she had worked for so long. In the months before her life ended, she'd been troubled by a general sense of unease about the guerrillas, as well as erratic patterns of behavior among them that she had never seen before and couldn't explain. There was a near fatal poisoning of her two parrots and other threats. Despite the risk, she continued her efforts, saying, "If I can enforce the rules of a supposedly protected park against the slaughter of animals, then I must do it." Her research camp, Karasaki, named after two of the Varenga Mountains, had officially been set up on September 24th, 1967. Her body would be found there, inside her house, on December 27th, 1985. Her skull split by an unknown assailant. Diane Fossey beautifully explained herself in Gorillas in the Mist. As a pioneer, I sometimes did endure loneliness, but I have reaped a tremendous satisfaction that followers will never be able to know. Quite an amazing lady and quite an adventurist. I hope you have a great week. Bye.